welcome everyone. My name is Eric Colleary. I'm the Ransom Center's client curator for theater and performing arts. Welcome to our first program in a new virtual series called Collection Connections, where we'll be highlighting rare and remarkable items from our collections and digging into them with experts from our field. It's really wonderful having you all here. I know there's a number of you that are just now tuning in and will be tuning in the next few minutes. If you're watching us live on Facebook, we really welcome your questions in the comments, so please add those. We'll be sure we save a bit of time at the end to get to some of your good questions. Just by way of a little bit of an introduction to the topic this evening, on November 18th, 1945, which was almost exactly 75 years ago, people across the country sat down to their radios. They tuned into the American Broadcasting Company and they heard a special Thanksgiving Day radio production of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. They heard from the radio announcer that the story was based on a popular play adaptation written by Helen Jerome. But what they didn't hear is that this adaptation for radio was written by a relatively unknown New Yorker named Arthur Miller. Miller would become a household name just 2 years later for his award-winning play All My Sons, and later for other major works like Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, The Misfits, View from the Bridge, many, many works. In addition to his work as a writer, he became a vocal free speech activist and a leading public intellectual. But back in 1945, Miller was making a living primarily as a writer for radio through programs like Cavalcade of America and Theater Guild on the Air. His brief work for the stage had come to an abrupt end in 1939 when the government shut down the federal theater project that he was working for. For a brief period, he worked for the Library of Congress to record regional accents and dialects. The Ransom Center is home to the Arthur Miller's papers, and it's through the archive and the archive at the Theater Guild here that we can get a glimpse at a largely forgotten part of Arthur Miller's career, and also a rather quirky adaptation of one of the most beloved novels in the English language. I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Dr. Janine Barchas. She's the Luann and Larry Temple Centennial Professor in English Literature at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Barchas is a leading expert on Jane Austen and the long life of Austen in popular culture. Her most recent monograph is The Lost Books of Jane Austen, which surveys the early reception history of Austen through the often overlooked, inexpensive mass market and unauthoritative prints of Austen's writing. She was the co-curator of a 2016 exhibition at the Folger Shakespeare Library called Will and Jane, Shakespeare, Austen, and the Cult of Celebrity. And in 2019, curated an exhibition at the Ransom Center called Austen in Austen, exploring the Jane Austen holdings at the Ransom Center and the unexpected copies of her work that have appeared in various other artist and author libraries that we hold. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having this chat with me about a really, really strange play.
It is such a strange play. And I'm so grateful to you for your work and digging into this and learning more about it and the sort of quirkiness of it. We've talked quite a bit that there's been a lot of adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, even just in the century before the radio play came about. Helen Jerome did a very famous stage production that came out in 1935. Was used as the basis of a film in 1940 with Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier. I'm wondering, given how popular this story is, how familiar would people have been with the Pride and Prejudice story going into listening to a radio play adaptation? And would they have known about it more from the novel or more from the play and the film adaptations?
I happen to have some cheap books here to demonstrate, I think, the answer to your question, which is sort of how ubiquitous would Pride and Prejudice have been during wartime. So the cheap versions of Pride and Prejudice were ubiquitous, and most of them were clad, as you can see, in the movie. So this one and this 25-cent paperback are actually the same still that has been reworked so as to avoid cunningly copyright issues, I bet. And then this one is also clad in the movie. And then this one, just post-war in Spanish, Six Pesetas in Spain, has Greer Garson on the cover. And this one in France, also post-war, again shows the movie. So I think that gives you a sense of how ubiquitous the reading of Pride and Prejudice was, but always clad in this very famous film, because it was the film that added that glamour to the story. And I know we both have, we could show pictures of Joan Fontaine's name in lights, as it were, on the front cover of this particular, or I mean, not everybody at their radio would have seen this kind of program. But I assume for those who knew about it ahead of time or who were attending, they got a program. And Joan Fontaine, yeah, she's the star. But to answer your question, people would have known this story, and it would have, however, been the movie vehicle that reached most of them rather than Helen Jerome's play.
You had mentioned, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but there's some overlap between the film and the radio play adaptation in terms of the actors and connections between, for example, Joan Fontaine and Olivier, who did the film.
Funny you should ask that. Let's see if I can share my screen and share the cast list from the, so confirm that you can see this.
Yes, absolutely.
But this is from the play as broadcast, or the manuscript, a typescript as broadcast in the HRC archives. This is where it all began for us when you said, "Hey, Janine, have you seen the Pride and Prejudice adaptation by Arthur Miller?" And I thought you were joking, Eric. And I thought it was so witty because surely that could not be the case. And here it is. Joan Fontaine, who was, of course, the star of Rebecca in 1940, and who in that movie starred opposite Laurence Olivier, who was Darcy in the 1940s film So Ubiquitous. And so it brings, through Joan Fontaine, even Darcy's proximity kind of into this play. Mr. Darcy is played by Carl Swenson, who, now you got to help me out, but he starred in that flop of Arthur Miller's the year before as the man who had all the luck. And so there's connectivity between Darcy and Miller in a different way as well. And Mr. Bennet, Percy Warham, actually initiated the role of Mr. Bennet in the Jerome play on Broadway. So he's kind of almost playing himself. And Ted Jewett is a famous name on the radio at the time. So, and by the way, this reduces the cast in Jerome's play from 26 to 12. So it really kind of condenses everything. But yeah, there's this interesting connectivity between this play and Miller, and well, yeah, one wonders what the impact on Miller was in interacting with this particular piece of Englishness.
There's so much sharing or crossover between the actors because New York, of course, is a hub for television, for radio, for film. Chicago, Los Angeles, and so folks are going around and doing similar productions. And a lot of the people who are producing radio plays in the 1940s, those are also theater companies. So you have Mercury Theater on the Air, which is Mercury Theater was the theater company of Orson Welles. Theater Guild itself, which produced a lot of the early works of Eugene O'Neill in the 1920s, they start getting their own radio program. So a lot of these folks, they must know each other in this way through working together. But you'd mentioned that there's a lot of variation too in a lot of these adaptations. I'm wondering how much of the radio play, which by the way, for folks who are tuning in, you can listen to that radio play online, the recording, the broadcast recording, and that's linked through our website. Not right now, but
please do, because it is, I mean, it's wonderful to talk about, but it is a hoot to listen to. It is just extraordinary, I think.
Absolutely. And I should also mention too, just taking a moment, if you're just tuning in, please do ask questions as we're going along, share them in the chat window in Facebook, and those we'll have time for those at the end. But given all those sort of weird, quirky adaptations, what if this play is actually Helen Jerome, and how much of this is actually Arthur Miller? Do you hear Arthur Miller's voice in this radio adaptation?
What I guess I do it the other way, right? You're the Arthur Miller expert in that sense. You have more data points. But what I don't hear is this. This is Helen Jerome's version. And it is more the sort of, I was struck upon reading the play script, and I read it before listening to and knowing that there was still a recording from 1945. So reading it, so the eye before the ear, and reading it, it is just so unbelievably, shockingly American. The Americanisms just leap off the page, where, because it says, you know, based on Helen Jerome's play, I was shocked that Elizabeth Bennet says to her mother, oh, you must be single, because every time a man crosses the county line who's single, you know, I know about it from you. And that phrase of sort of every time a single man crosses the county line, yeah, in England you have counties, but you don't use it in that idiomatic way, the way that she does. And then when the girls hear about the ball in Netherfield, and they're going to give a ball, everyone gets a new dress, and Lydia says, me too, me too. Elizabeth says, we'll buy you a harpoon, Lydia. And that's what I was reading, and it sounded to me like that. It sounded like an Americanism. It's like something out of Melville, not out of Jane Austen or Helen Jerome. And reading this confirms how, yeah, he cribs from the play, but he tosses in some serious Americanisms and masculinizing kinds of ways in which things get contracted, because of course it has to fit into an hour. So I didn't recognize it on the page as the story. I mean, it's the story of Pride and Prejudice, but there are 3 daughters and not 5. In the Jerome play as well, you know, they're not 5 daughters, but 3. Let's keep it simple. Let's sort of take out all the extras and center the story. He doesn't center the story on Darcy and Elizabeth. He just sort of races through like some sort of magic train wreck. It's fabulous.
And the speed of the broadcast, I mean, they're going pretty fast. So there's a sense of urgency in some ways that they have to get this in within an hour. Otherwise, they're going to have to cut something maybe on the fly.
Yeah, there's a major sort of pace that it's a very fast clip. And in the typescript, you see a lot of half blank pages where I'm assuming, because this is as broadcast, and we know that in Miller's own archive, there is one that says 3rd or 4th version. So it went through multiple versions. This is not something he did, you know, the night before. And in the typing pool, they must have crossed things out and then sent it back to have retyped. And then a page becomes just that top section, the rest is left blank, and it gets inserted cleanly into the text. So you also have a lot of numbered pages with A and B, and you get a sense of the multiple versions, even looking at the clean script. And yeah, that suggests that it got shorter and shorter and shorter, and in a way that feels very clipped. The play, you know, the Jerome play opens with descriptions of the theater set and all these things that a director would need to know and to set the scene. And of course, on a radio play, you don't need that, but you need a narrator saying, and it smelled like lilac water and lavender, because, you know, it's a house full of women. And I just, yeah, it's like a Wild West does Jane Austen more than it feels like a radio, a genre switch from stage to radio.
We know from Arthur Miller's interviews that the process was he would draft a version of the script. It would be about a 3-day rehearsal process, so 2 days, full days, with the actors in the studio running through the script multiple times, rewrites during that, trying to get it down to the time that it needs to be. And then he was required contractually to be in the studio during the broadcast in case other things needed to be cut as it was going. So yeah, that sort of urgency is certainly there even as the broadcast is happening.
How interesting that you can see that in the kind of material evidence in an archive, that you can see or guess at some of that process.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering if, since it is so different than the Helen Jerome play, do you have thoughts about why they still, I mean, it's Joan Fontaine in Pride and Prejudice from the play by Helen Jerome. And Arthur Miller is rarely, he's not even mentioned in the
He's
broadcast.
nobody. He just had a flop. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, but yeah.
So why credit Helen Jerome when there's very little of the work in there? Why do you think that was important?
The movie does it too. The movie begins in 1940 with a shot of essentially kind of a stage door or a stage marquee with Pride and Prejudice on it, and describes it as sort of the great Broadway play. And now we enter the movie. So there's a way in which the torch does get passed, and it lends a certain brand and popularity to something. You're listening to a radio play. It was a great Broadway play. It was it was a stage production first. So I don't know. I mean, now, post 1995 and Colin Firth, we would never, sort of not do the direct line of descent. But at that time, Jane Austen didn't have that kind of popularizing vehicle except for the movie and the play. And so why not pull that in?
So
And as you indicate, the sort of dividing lines between Hollywood and the stage are crossed over so much more than they would be now, maybe.
yeah, so in some degree, it's a marketing technique, just because people would know the story. It's also this passing of the torch. Do you
Yeah.
think it would be fascinating to see if there's any accounts, critical reviews or anything like that, to see if there was
Whether people actually liked it, or whether
yeah, or there was disappointment that they were.
Yeah, I would love to. So there's one scene. So we've just talked about all this tightening and tightening and tightening. There is one scene that for the life of me, I just don't understand why it's in there. And it's invented. It's the corset scene. It is the scene where Jane laces Elizabeth Bennet into a corset, and they talk about the silliness of corsets and that their backbones backwards. And you're thinking, wait, Janine, are you talking about Gone with the Wind? Because I remember that scene in Gone with the Wind, but I don't remember it in Jane Austen or in Helen Jerome's play. It's a total invention, and I don't know why we need it, but apparently that is, I don't know, I dare I say it, a man's version of a sisterly moment is we must have undergarments. And so it is a really strange moment, but it allows Elizabeth Bennet and Jane Bennet to exchange some intimacies before we move on to the next scene.
That's got to be such a challenge too in the adaptation, is knowing that you're losing all of this content and still finding those ways like, oh, well, we actually really do need to still find a way to establish the sisters' relationship with each other. Do they like each other? And so finding those, in some cases, even just completely fabricated.
Yeah, and in Miller's production of Pride and Prejudice, the Elizabeth Bennet really is upset at Darcy about not just Wickham but Jane in ways that she, of course, in the novel is too, but that's almost heightened by the brevity of the piece, and so we need to know that that they have this special relationship, and that Lydia is apart from that, the other sister, and but it's just a really strange way of doing it. And when I say strange, I embrace it in all its oddity, and I think it is delightfully strange in that sense, in the way that some adaptations just sort of surprise you and make you think about the authentic original and where you can listen to it and where you no longer hear it.
It's very of the moment. I mean, it's very American 1940s Arthur Miller radio play. Like it's sort of what you would think it would be, and it's kind of charming in that respect.
It's charming. The charm is partly because it also feels just wrong.
Hmm.
And that it's not sort of like brilliantly capturing the spirit of Jane Austen. What did you say earlier before people joined us? Sort of the comic.
This,
Well,
yeah, that Christopher Bixby, who was Arthur Miller's authorized biographer, when he was talking about Miller's radio work, he mentioned specifically the Pride and Prejudice and said that, I have it actually.
comically forward, or
It's adapted none too faithfully for an American audience in an adaptation that lays rather greater stress on comedy than even Jane Austen. That it's this idea that it's somehow more comic forward than even Jane
comic
Austen was
forward
doing.
as in like bring out the whoopee cushions and the gags, and let's not trust Austen's subtle wit to entertain the masses. Let's really give them some jokes. And by pumping up, and the movie does this too, of course. Huxley and Jerome's play is not bears little resemblance to the film in 1940 as well, in which Hollywood had the same anxieties perhaps about Jane Austen not being funny enough or thought to be funny enough by a popular audience, and that the subtlety needed some gags, need some good music, and um, some things, some lines that make you laugh. The one I was telling you about earlier about Elizabeth Bennet. I don't know if people want to see a page, from the actual um, uh, manuscript or typescript, but here is kind of a typical Mr. Collins comes and proposes to Elizabeth, and she's going to, and this was a scene that if you knew Pride and Prejudice, this is the scene that you were waiting for, is the booby Mr. Collins going to propose to Elizabeth, and she's going to kind of give him a slap and send him packing. And it is such a short scene here. Instead of dragging it out as Jerome kind of does to get as much comedy out of it, here he says, I wish to speak to you not as a man of the cloth, but you might say as a man. And Elizabeth says, really, you mustn't strain yourself. And I think of that as broad comedy in a way that's not Austen. Not that it's bad. It's funny. I enjoyed it. But that's the kind of adaptation it is.
But
And
I wonder though, if given the film is 1940, so Britain is in the middle, just in the middle of World War II, and then the radio play is just literally months, just a couple months after the end of the war. Is the comedy a side effect of the war? Is the comedy? Do you think the comedy is something that people are saying, we got to make this lighter, we got to make this comic. This is what people need right now.
I think that that's a really good assumption. And the Pride and Prejudice wasn't the only vehicle made by Hollywood to convince the American public to enter the war at all. So the movie was made in 1940. America didn't enter the theater of war until 43, right? And in the meantime, Hollywood was producing a lot of classic English, British novels, Rebecca included, Jane Eyre included, and Pride and Prejudice, maybe to kind of partly to convince the American public that this was the kind of heritage worth salvaging, and that high culture was enjoyable, and that the places where it took place needed to be protected. And that there's so much, I mentioned this to you earlier as well, so much war inside this radio production that gets cut out in the archive where the recording exists, but all the commercial breaks have been taken out. And by doing so, you take out the references to war bonds, the US Steel interludes where our sponsor, US Steel, gets to narrate for like the length of a Bible, a story about the first well in America, the young men coming back from the war that the US Steel has hired, and then Joan Fontaine at the end selling war bonds. So you've just heard her as Elizabeth Bennet for an hour, and then she comes back on and she's telling you, we need these victory bonds, is what they're then called. And invest in the victory bonds just one last time. This is the last time I'm going to ask, is essentially what she says. And those are constant reminders. Even Darcy, he's 37. There are not a lot of young men in this play. I mean, our leading lad is 37 years old. Yeah, I think that war is constantly present throughout, and that the comedy must be part of that reassurance.
It seems like there's almost a collapsing then of American and British culture in this radio play presentation, to have Elizabeth Bennet suddenly transforming back into Joan Fontaine, and then, you know, trying to sell American victory bonds.
Well, we've talked about the accents that they have and how surprised. Yeah, I know you're going there.
No, but this you had mentioned before about how strange of an experience it was to read the text first, and then to experience a very different kind of a play by actually hearing the broadcast. And I'm wondering how that difference, what was that difference? What were the things that you noticed?
Well, I was bowled over by that difference. And I was reading the play, and as I narrated earlier, I was hearing all these Americanisms and how American this sounded, and it hadn't occurred to me. I mean, I know Joan Fontaine and recognized a number of the other names, but it hadn't occurred to me what it would sound like. And then the moment the play starts, the moment everyone assumes this mid-Atlantic fake kind of quirky accent that makes them neither American nor British, and puts them in this neutrality zone that would allow all these actors to move around the country and not sound regional. And so, yeah, I understand that that's what, you know, mid-Atlantic accent is what we call the training people received at the time to be able to have that kind of mobility. But it's the perfect expression of the kind of unity between between America and the Brits fighting in the theater of World War II, that is now united, and you can't hear who's British and who's American. And Elizabeth does sound vaguely American when she says that she'll buy Lydia a harpoon with which to snag a man at the ball. And everything kind of, it's sort of jolly and unified in a way that's so wrong. I mean, as a Jane Austen scholar, I have to say that it's just so wrong, and yet it's marvelous too. And in 1945, I think it would have been, that kind of neutrality would have been reassuring, and would have kind of felt like a unifying element.
So a piece that isn't necessarily true to the original story, the original novel.
True. I mean, this is not about authenticity.
But certainly something of the moment, and something that, as we dig through it, that it's actually an incredible snapshot of a particular moment, and how people, you know, bigger issues, the war, you know, about access and about labor and about who was able to do these things. And even just the accessibility of radio at the time, that this isn't the ability to do it as a radio play as opposed to a stage production, where this broadcast is going into homes across the country all at the same time.
19.4% of all of the entire American radio audience was listening to that night.
Just incredible. That's a huge number of people.
1 out of 5 people in America who had a radio listened to this show and listened to this version of Pride and Prejudice. I don't know how, you know, it'd be interesting to really be able to see how you could test what kind of impact it had, whether people thought that Jane Austen was, well, really funny and a thigh-slapping good time in the wake of that, or whether this had a kind of recognized as an independent moment of entertainment that, like so many adaptations today, you know, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies or what have you, is almost as far removed from the original as this is. And yet it is, as you indicate, kind of TARDIS to 1945. I mean, it's also the reason to watch the 1940 movie now. Is not because of its great, you know, sort of time travel to the Regency and those Gone with the Wind gowns. It's about seeing how in 1940 Jane Austen was being celebrated, being altered by her contemporary audience in 1940, and here too in 1945, she's yeah, she's clay that's being molded into a vehicle that's genuinely entertaining, and may have brought people to read the novel. I don't know. These things usually do. Students today watch a lot of movie versions, some of which I don't think are great, and some of which are wonderful. And that it seems to inspire them to want to take a class and read the real deal. So, yeah, I think Hollywood is still working for us, and the radio play version was working for Austen in 1945.
Absolutely. We have some questions that have been coming in during this
Oh,
time.
bring it on.
Yeah. Leah on Facebook asked, she mentions Elizabeth Bennet is much more outspoken about women's empowerment in this version than the original novel. It definitely feels like a lot of additions were made to match the climate of America after World War II. Do you have any thoughts about Elizabeth Bennet's character, perhaps, in this that are different than the
No,
novel?
Leah, who's asking the question, is absolutely right. There are Joan Fontaine in the role of Elizabeth Bennet is this feisty, biting, snarky girl who is very aggressive about having studied biology and making jokes about biology. And Lady Catherine de Bourgh, you know, it's um, it is, I think, an expression of its time, that the spunky feminism of Jane Austen is sort of brought a little bit further forward. And that's true. I mean, I've written about that Spanish edition that I showed you earlier, sort of these cheap um, uh, editions that where Jane Austen's pert heroine represents a certain kind of feminism at a certain kind of moment that was advancing things and looked to speak to that, as opposed to now where she's deemed a little bit more retro, depending on what edition or film version you see.
Hmm. We have a question from Arnie Perlstein, who says, I listened to the radio play and I believe that Miller understood the prominence of Much Ado About Nothing as a source for Pride and Prejudice. At one point early in the radio play, I think it's Miller's Mr. Bennet who says, quote, the world must be populated, which seems to me a broad wink at Benedict's the world must be peopled in Much Ado About Nothing. When he's taken in by the matchmaking cupids, he says. He's wondering whether or not this was part of Jerome's play, these sort of gestures back maybe to Shakespeare.
Well, I mean, I think, Arnie's right to hear the echo. I think that Jane Austen is right in Mansfield Park when she says we all talk Shakespeare. Even when we, don't know the verse we're quoting, it's just part of the way we speak, and that gets transferred down. And I'm sure Miller knew his Shakespeare too. And this particular story, which is about two people a man and a woman, who are going to get together at the end, and this is going to be a romance, and it's introduced that way in 1945 in the radio play. The introducer says that this is a great romance, and that's how it's being served up, so it's going to end well. And so those echoes would be prominent even if they weren't deliberate.
There's one last question we'll take from the folks who are watching. From Cassidy Schultz, she asks, did they choose to do this as a radio play for the accessibility, as a story that people would have known? Do you think, looking maybe at other radio plays around the time, is this a story that people would have connected with?
Well, I mean, as we discussed earlier, the movie makes this well known to the audience. And yeah, this is the Thanksgiving final closing number on the national radio program of that particular weekend, of the Sunday that closes that Thanksgiving family holiday. And so, yeah, I think that Jane Austen is being chosen here as a topper. There, the Theatre Guild archive better than I, and that some of those plays don't have that kind of status anymore. And you think, what was that one about? So that there are ways in which this one does stand out. as famous then, famous now, and for good reason. It is a good yarn, and you know, I mean, I suppose you could say not even Arthur Miller could ruin it, but he adds something too. It's not just about subtraction. It's about kind of making it participate in the moment.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Dr. Janine Barchas, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody who's been watching. We hope you'll join us for our next conversation and reading with former US Poet Laureate Billy Collins, which is on Thursday, December 3rd. You can find out more about this event and all the others in our virtual series on our website, which is at hrc.utexas.edu, and follow us on social media for the latest updates. But we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Dr. Barchas, thank you again.
And go listen, everybody go listen to the 1945 recording. It's hilarious.
Absolutely. And you can find the link for that on our website as well. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.